She didn't know the bucket of spilled water would end her old life and begin something far more dangerous. For 19 years, Clara Whitfield survived her mother's cruelty in the frozen heart of Wyoming's high country until the morning a mountain trapper named Jed Calloway paid $50 in gold to take her away. What came next wasn't rescue. It was war. Hired guns, fire in the night, a pistol in her trembling hand, and a choice that would define everything she would ever become. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far Clara's story travels. Let's begin. The cold came first. It always did in Wyoming winters, threading itself through the gaps in the cabin walls like something alive, something patient, something that had learned long ago that waiting was its greatest weapon. Clara Whitfield had learned the same lesson. She woke before dawn, not because she wanted to, but because her body had trained itself over 19 years to rise before the darkness gave way, before her mother's voice could shatter whatever fragile quiet the night had granted her. She lay still for a moment on her pallet listening. The wind moved through the pine crowns above the ridge, a low and mournful sound that she had always found more comforting than threatening. Somewhere beyond the cabin wall, the mule shifted in the lean-to and stamped once against the frozen earth. Clara counted her breaths the way she always did, giving herself 10 before she had to move. It was the only ritual she owned. On the 10th breath, she rose. The bucket was waiting by the door, same as every morning, crusted with last night's ice along the handle. She wrapped her fingers in the strips of old flannel pulled on her oversized boots 2 sizes too large, stuffed with newspaper that crinkled when she walked and stepped out outside into the gray December dark. The well was 40 feet from the cabin. Clara had walked that distance so many times she could have done it blind, and sometimes when the snowdrifts swallowed the path she nearly did. She worked the handle with both hands, listening to the rope creak and the bucket drop down into the dark water below. The cold burned her cheeks. The bruise below her left eye throbbed with each pump of the handle, a deep purple bloom that had appeared 3 days ago, courtesy of her mother's ring, which Eleanor Whitfield wore on her right hand for reasons Clara had stopped trying to understand. She lifted the full bucket and turned for the cabin. That was when her boot found the patch of ice beneath the fresh snow. Her foot slid. She caught herself against the well post with one elbow, but the bucket tilted, and a full third of the water splashed across the frozen ground in a dark spreading fan. Clara stood perfectly still, staring down at it. Her heart had stopped somewhere between the slip and the spill. It wasn't much. She could still see that it wasn't much. The bucket was more than half full, plenty for washing and cooking, plenty for everything a morning required. But Eleanor Whitfield did not measure need. She measured obedience, and obedience had no tolerance for fractions. The cabin door opened before Clara could take a single step. What in the world? Her mother's voice came out flat and cold, each word its own sentence. Eleanor stood in the doorway, backlit by the orange flicker of the hearth arms crossed over her chest, her dark hair pulled so tight against her skull, it gave her whole face a stretched and vigilant look. She was a tall woman, raw-boned and angular, and the firelight behind her made her look like something carved rather than born. "I slipped," Clara said. "I'll get more." "You'll get more." Eleanor came down the porch steps without a coat, which meant she intended this to be short. "You'll get more, and then you'll tell me what you were doing dragging your feet across ground you've walked 1,000 mornings." I wasn't. Was I finished? The question was quiet, which was always worse. Eleanor's voice got soft when she was at her most dangerous, the way a sky goes still before a hard storm. She stopped 3 feet from Clara and looked at her daughter the way a farmer looks at a fence post that has gone crooked with irritation and the calm certainty that it will be corrected. "Go back to the well, get a full bucket, then get yourself into town. Mr. Hargrove at the feed store needs someone to sweep and stock. You're going." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor's eyes moved to Clara's face, settling on the bruise. "What are you telling people about that?" "I fell," Clara said, "against the woodpile." A pause, her mother's gaze held for a moment, testing the statement, the way you test ice by pressing one foot onto it before committing your weight. Then she nodded, turned and went back inside without another word. The door closed with a click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Clara stood in the snow alone, letting the cold work its way deeper. Sometimes the numbness helped. It moved from her fingers inward, spreading until it found the places that hurt most, and covered them over like fresh snow covers, old mud, not healing it but hiding it, which was its own kind of mercy. She breathed until her hands steadied, then went back to the well. The walk to Iron Creek took just under 2 hours in deep snow. It was the only town within reasonable distance of the Whitfield homestead, a mining settlement of perhaps 300 souls that had grown up along the banks of a creek that ran copper-colored from the ore washing out of the mountains to the north. Clara made this walk 2 or 3 times a week, sent by Eleanor to work for whatever merchant needed an extra pair of hands. She swept floors, stacked goods, mended harnesses, cleaned out stalls. At the end of each day, someone would press coins into her palm, never many but always enough to show for, and she would carry them home and give them to her mother without being asked, because asking was not a word that applied to Eleanor Whitfield. She kept her head down against the wind and let her mind wander to the places it always found on long walks. She thought about books she had loved reading once before Eleanor decided it was self-indulgent and put the 3 volumes she owned up on a shelf too high to reach without being noticed. She thought about the valley on the south side of the mountain, where in summer the wildflowers came up so thick the whole slope looked painted. She thought about a different life, which was the most dangerous thing she could do, and which she did anyway, the way you keep touching a bruise even when you know it hurts. She had tried to leave once when she was 16. She'd made it 2 valleys over before a trapper found her half frozen and brought her back, genuinely believing he was doing the right thing. Eleanor had thanked him warmly, waited until he was down the road, and locked Clara in the root cellar for 3 days. When she came out, she was smaller, in some way that had nothing to do with size, and she had not tried again. Iron Creek appeared through the snow the same way it always did. First the church steeple cutting above the tree line, then the false fronts of the buildings along Main Street, then the people themselves moving with the purposeful efficiency of those who have learned to waste no movement in a cold climate. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and pushed through the door of Hargrove's Feed and Supply. The warmth hit her like a wall. She stood for a moment in the doorway, letting it settle over her, feeling her face begin to thaw. The store smelled of grain and lamp oil and the faint sweetness of dried corn, and it was the smell she associated most with relief, with the particular mercy of being somewhere she was not required to be afraid. "Clara!" Mr. Hargrove looked up from behind his counter, a round-faced man whose kindness expressed itself mostly in the careful way he avoided looking directly at her face. "Got a shipment in yesterday, crates in the back, need unpacking. Shelves need straightening after that." "Yes, sir, thank you." She meant it. She always meant it. The work was hard and repetitive, and her back would ache by afternoon, but she was warm and away from Eleanor, and that was worth any amount of labor. She worked through the morning in the back room, breaking down crates of canned goods and dry goods, stacking tins in precise rows with their labels facing out, carrying heavy burlap sacks of flour and grain to their positions on the shelves. Her hands moved automatically, her mind in that comfortable, neutral place she had learned to find in repetitive work, not thinking, not feeling, just the weight and the motion in the next task. Around noon, Hargrove called her to the front counter to help with the midday rush. She took her place behind the worn wood and began weighing orders and making change invisible in the way she preferred, present but unremarkable, a piece of the furniture. Then the door opened. The man who came in was not from town. Clara knew that before she had consciously processed anything else about him. There was something in the way he moved, the particular stillness he carried, that belonged to the high country and not to settlements. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in heavy furs that still carried the smell of pinon and cold air in the deep wilderness. His face was weathered by sun and wind into a landscape of lines, and his dark eyes moved through the store with a calm, total awareness that reminded Clara of the way certain predators move through the forest, not threatening exactly but wholly alert, missing nothing. She had heard of Jed Calloway. Everyone in Iron Creek had heard of Jed Calloway the same way everyone hears of weather patterns and rock slides, as a force of nature about which you have opinions, but not much influence. He came down from the high country 2 or 3 times a season to trade furs and buy supplies, spoke little, kept entirely to himself, and disappeared back into the mountains in a way that always seemed slightly miraculous to people who needed roads and neighbors to feel secure. People said he'd lived with the Crow people for 2 winters after his wife died. People said he'd tracked a man who owed him money 200 miles through a blizzard. People said a lot of things about Jed Calloway, and looking at him now, Clara found herself believing most of them. He moved through the store with the quiet efficiency of someone who has made this specific trip dozens of times and sees no point in dramatizing it. Coffee, salt, ammunition, a coil of rope, a small bottle of liniment. He brought them to the counter and set them down without looking at her, and Clara began tallying the total with hands that she was irritated to notice were not entirely steady. "That'll be $4.20, she said. He reached into his coat for a leather pouch. As he counted out coins, methodical and unhurried, his gaze moved up from the counter and found her face, found the bruise. He didn't look away. Most people looked away. Clara was so accustomed to the quick flicker of the eyes, the deliberate redirection of attention, that his steadiness startled her. She dropped her own gaze and concentrated on the coins he was setting down. "You work here regular?" he asked. His voice was low and roughened at the edges, like timber that has been left out in weather. "When Mr. Hargrove needs help." "Your mother know you're here?" The question was odd enough that she looked up. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not pity, not curiosity, not the particular kind of interest that sometimes appeared on men's faces when they looked at her. Something more careful than any of those. "She sent me," Clara said. He nodded slowly. He gathered his parcels, and Clara thought that was the end of it, thought he would turn and walk out the door, and she would return to being invisible. But he paused at the threshold, one hand on the door frame, and looked back. "That bruise," he said. "You fall, Every instinct she possessed told her to say yes, yes, sir, against the woodpile. "I'm clumsy, and the cold mornings happens all the time." The words were so well rehearsed they lived closer to the front of her mind than her own name. "Yes, sir," she said, "woodpile." He was quiet for a moment, and the quality of his quiet was different from other silences. Heavier, somehow more considered. "Wood doesn't leave ring marks," he said. The words hit her like cold water. She stood perfectly still, the half-wrapped parcels in her hands, unable to look at him and unable to look away. The shame came first, as it always did, not shame at what Eleanor had done, but the deeper, more corrosive shame of being seen, of having the careful architecture of her lies examined and found flimsy by a stranger in a feed store on an ordinary Tuesday. "I'm fine," she whispered. "Didn't ask if you were fine." He shifted his weight against the doorframe. "I said, what happened?" "I told you." "You told me what you were told to tell me." His voice remained even without accusation. "There's a difference." She had no answer for that. Her throat had closed around whatever response she might have offered, and she stood there in the warm store with her face burning and her hands still in the silence stretching between them like a rope pulled tight. "You're loyal to someone who hasn't earned it," Jed Calloway said finally. And then, before she could find her voice, "Think on that." He left. The door swung shut behind him. Clara stood at the counter for a long moment, not moving, not thinking, just existing in the peculiar, suspended state his words had created. In 19 years, no one had said anything like that to her. No one had called it loyalty. No one had suggested it could be given to someone who didn't deserve it. No one had, in any way that mattered, seen her at all. Mr. Hargrove paid her at the end of the day 4 coins, a little more than usual, and the careful non-look of a man who knows more than he says. Clara pocketed the money and stepped back out into the cold. The walk home was harder. The temperature had dropped with the sun, and the wind had picked up to something that cut through her shawl like it was made of smoke. Her feet ached. Her hands were numb inside their flannel wrappings. She moved mechanically, head down, counting her steps the way she sometimes did on bad nights, using the numbers as something to hold on to. She was halfway up the mountain road when she heard footsteps behind her. Clara spun around. The road was empty. Shadows pooled beneath the pine trees on either side, deep and shapeless in the last gray light. She stood still, listening, and heard nothing but the wind. She turned back toward home and quickened her pace. The footsteps came again, closer now. She broke into a run. She made it perhaps 15 yards before a hand closed on her shoulder from behind, and she screamed, spinning with her fists already raised, ready to easy. Jed Calloway stood in the snow, hands raised, his breath misting in the cold. He had appeared out of the tree line to her left, and she had not heard him coming until he was there, which told her everything the stories claimed about the man was probably true. "Easy, I'm not going to hurt you." Clara stood with her fists up, chest heaving, heart slamming against her ribs. "What do you want?" "To talk. I have to get home." "I know." He didn't lower his hands, giving her the time she needed to lower hers first. What happens when you get there? I don't know what you know. What happens when you get there tonight with 4 coins instead of 8 coming back earlier than dark? His voice was quiet and precise. What happens then? The question broke through something. Not the wall itself that was built from 19 years of necessity, and she couldn't have dismantled it if she tried, but it found the place where the mortar was thin, where the stones had been laid by a frightened child instead of a grown woman, and it found the crack. "It'll be fine," she said. The words were hollow, and they both knew it. "Will it?" No, it wouldn't. Eleanor would see the coins and count them and find them insufficient. She would smell the cold on Clara and know she had come back before sundown, and there would be an accounting for that too. There was always an accounting. There was always something Clara had done wrong or failed to do right, some inadequacy discovered and documented in Eleanor Whitfield's private ledger of her daughter's failures. "I don't have a choice," Clara said. The truth of it came out before she could dress it up as something more bearable. Jed was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere far up the mountain, a branch or a beam of ice cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. "Everyone's got a choice," he said. "Question is whether you are willing to make it." "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think." His voice roughened slightly, not with anger, but with something older and more personal. "I understand what it looks like when someone's been beaten down so long, they forget they're able to stand. I understand what fear does to a person over years. And I understand that if you walk up that mountain tonight, tomorrow isn't going to be any different than today." Tears burned at the corners of Clara's eyes. She blinked them back hard. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing." He reached into his coat and pulled out the leather pouch she'd seen earlier. "But I'm offering you something." She stared at the pouch. "I don't want your money." "It's not for you." He held her gaze. "Come with me." The words hit her like a step she hadn't expected, a sudden drop in a familiar floor. "What?" "Come with me, back to my cabin. You'll be safe, fed, warm. Your mother won't lay a hand on you again." He said it the same way he said everything, quiet and level, as if the offer were the most ordinary thing in the world. "No conditions. You work if you want it, to learn if you want to leave when you're ready. But tonight you don't go back to her." Clara stared at him. The cold pressed in on all sides. The snow around their boots was turning blue in the dying light. "You don't know me," she said. "Don't need to." "Men don't." She stopped. Started again. "Nothing comes without a price." "You've been told that." He met her eyes steadily. "Doesn't make it true." "Then why would you do this for a stranger?" Something moved across his face, then brief and old and unmistakably painful. The same expression she had seen in the store when he looked at her, bruised but deeper now, like a scar turned toward the light. "Because 19 years ago," he said quietly, "nobody did it for me." The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. Clara looked down at the coins in her palm. 4 pieces of cold copper that would never be enough, that had never been enough, that would buy her only another day of exactly what she had always had. She thought about the cabin waiting at the top of the mountain, about Eleanor's face when she walked in, about the familiar geography of fear that she had navigated her whole life, which floorboards creaked, which tone of voice meant silence was safer than speech, which expressions to arrange her face into so as to take up as little space as possible. She thought about Jed Calloway's question. What happens when you get there? She knew. She had always known. "If I go with you," she said slowly, "my mother will come looking. Let her. She'll tell people you took me, that you forced. I'll handle it." His voice was certain without being loud. "But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight's problem is simpler." He watched her carefully. "Do you want to go home?" The answer rose from somewhere so deep inside her that it surprised her, not the answer itself, which she had always known, but the fact that she was willing to hear it out loud, to let it exist in the cold air between them as a real thing rather than a dangerous wish. "No," she whispered. "Then don't." She looked at him for a long moment, this stranger with his weathered face and his careful eyes and his offer of something she had stopped believing existed. She thought about how insane it was. She thought about the root cellar, age 16, 3 days in the dark. "We have to tell her," Clara said finally. "I can't just disappear. She's my mother. I have to, I need to face her. She steadied herself. I need to say it to her face. Jed studied her. Then slowly he nodded. Together then, he said. We go together. Clara had not expected that. She had expected him to talk her out of it, to say it was unnecessary or too dangerous, or not worth the trouble. Instead, he simply turned and waited for her to fall into step beside him, as though the decision were entirely hers, and his role were only to make sure she didn't have to walk it alone. They climbed toward the Whitfield cabin through the darkening evening, their footsteps making a double track in the fresh snow, the cold pressing down from above, while the mountain pressed up from below, and Clara felt the fear in her belly transmuting into something else. Not courage, exactly, not yet, but its raw material. The potential of it, the knowledge that something was about to change and that she had been the one to choose it. The cabin looked different than it always had, though nothing about it had changed. It was the same sagging porch, the same gaps in the chimney stones, the same lean that made the whole structure look exhausted by its own continued existence. But seeing it now through the cold, clear air, with someone standing beside her who was not afraid of it, Clara understood something she had always sensed but never articulated. It was small. It had always been small. It was only in her imagination, in the architecture of her fear, that it had grown into something enormous. Eleanor must have heard them on the path. The door flew open before they reached the porch steps. Clara Whitfield, where in the... She stopped. Her eyes moved from her daughter to the man beside her, and the calculation in them was instantaneous, a rapid reassessment of the situation that shifted her face from fury to something harder and more controlled. Mr. Calloway, this is unexpected. Evening, Mrs. Whitfield. Jed's voice was pleasant. Your daughter won't be coming home tonight. Eleanor blinked. Then, with the precision of someone who has survived by knowing exactly which weapons to deploy, I beg your pardon. She's coming with me. She'll be safe and properly cared for. He spoke without hostility or apology, the way you state the weather. This isn't a negotiation. The silence that followed had texture. Eleanor descended the porch steps slowly, and Clara watched her mother's face go through its full repertoire: shock, fury, calculation, performance, before settling on the expression of wounded dignity she wore for audiences. You cannot take someone's child, Eleanor said. That is kidnapping, Mr. Calloway. That is a crime for which men go to prison. She's 19, Jed said, and she's going willingly. He glanced at Clara. Tell her. Clara looked at her mother, at the face she had studied her whole life, the way you study terrain that can kill you, memorizing its patterns, its warning signs, its sudden shifts. Eleanor Whitfield was watching her with an expression that contained all the old threats wrapped in new packaging, daring her in the language that had always passed between them to be small enough to back down. I'm leaving, Clara said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. I'm not coming back. Something moved through Eleanor's face. For just a moment, less than a second, Clara saw it, not grief, not love, but something almost like relief quickly buried under a fresh layer of performance. After everything I've done for you, Eleanor said, after every year I kept a roof over your head. He paid her for your labor, Jed said, and reached into his coat. He poured the gold coins into his palm in the firelight, and Eleanor's speech stopped the way a creek stops when you dam it suddenly completely. Clara had never seen so much money in one place. Neither evidently had Eleanor, because the fury in her face fractured along a fault line she probably hadn't known was there. $50, Jed said, for 19 years of work without wages. That's more than fair, and we both know it. Take it and let her go. Or I walk down to the sheriff in Iron Creek tomorrow morning and have a conversation about the bruises on your daughter's face. Your choice. Eleanor's jaw worked. Her hands opened and closed at her sides. The firelight played across the gold in Jed's palm, and Clara watched her mother's eyes move to it and stay there, and understood with a clarity that was almost gentle that this was who Eleanor had always been underneath the cruelty, a frightened and diminished woman who had learned to make herself feel large by making her daughter feel small. Eleanor's hands shot out and the coins disappeared into her fist. Fine, she said. Her voice had gone flat and cold. Take her. See if I care. Her eyes moved to Clara, and there was something in them that was not love and not quite hatred, but something between the two, complicated and unwilling. She was always more trouble than she was worth anyway. The words landed. Clara waited for the familiar collapse, the internal flinching, the wave of self-doubt that had always followed Eleanor's pronouncements. It didn't come. She stood in the snow with her feet cold and her hands numb, and felt instead something that might have been pity. "I'd like my grandmother's shawl," Clara said. "It's on the peg inside the door. It was her mother's before her, and it came to me when she passed. I'm not leaving without it." Eleanor's face twisted. "You don't get to take—" Jed was already on the porch. He pushed the door open, reached inside, and came back with the shawl in his hands, a heavy wool thing in brown and cream, worn smooth at the edges by decades of use. He looked at Clara. She nodded, and he draped it around her shoulders with a care that was so matter-of-fact it barely registered in the moment, but would stay with her for years. "The shawl belongs to her," he said to Eleanor. "You've got your gold. Be satisfied." Eleanor stood on her porch steps in the cold gold clenched in her fist and watched her daughter walk away. She shouted something after them. Clara heard the words but found they had lost their power to reach her, as though the distance between them were already more than physical. She did not look back. They walked in silence for a long time, following the trail that led west and north away from the road into the deeper country. The moon emerged from behind the clouds and turned the snow to silver, and Clara walked through it feeling as though she were moving through a dream that was nevertheless more real than anything that had preceded it. "How far?" she asked. "4 miles roughly. Valley on the north face sheltered. Cabin's been there 12 years. You built it. With help." A pause. "Had a friend among the Crow man named Standing Elk. He taught me how to read this country. He passed 3 winters back." His voice carried grief, brief, genuine, and quickly folded back. "Good man. Better than most." Clara thought about asking more. There was so much she didn't know about this man who had just altered the entire course of her existence. But exhaustion was settling over her in waves, and the magnitude of what she had done was only beginning to register the sheer tectonic weight of having for the first time in her life chosen something for herself. "Are you going to tell me what you expect of me?" she asked. Jed walked in silence for a moment. "I expect you to eat regular meals," he said. "Sleep without fear. Heal, that's all." Another pause. "Beyond that, I don't expect anything. People don't do things like this for nothing." "I'm not people." He glanced at her sidelong. "I'm just someone who recognizes a situation he could do something about." They crested a ridge, and the valley opened below them, a broad white bowl nestled against the mountain's shoulder with the cabin at its center that glowed with warm light from a single window, smoke rising straight up from the chimney in the still cold air. Even from a distance, she could see it was solid, good logs proper. Chinking, a covered wood pile, a smokehouse, a shed. Someone had built this place to last. Jed held the door for her. She stepped inside. The warmth was immediate and total, and Clara stood in the middle of it for a moment without moving, letting it soak in. The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft above the furniture, simple and well-made, the floor covered in furs, the shelves along the walls holding books and supplies in equal measure. A pot of something savory hung over the fire. "Sit," Jed said, gesturing to the chair by the hearth. "I'll get you something to eat." She sat. The chair creaked under her weight, and she gripped the armrest and looked around at this place that was not her home and did not know yet what it would become. She watched Jed move around the cabin with the practiced ease of someone who has lived alone long enough that all his routines are completely efficient, ladling stew, cutting bread, setting a tin cup of water on the small table beside the chair without being asked. "Eat slow," he said. "You're probably not used to full meals." He was right. She took small bites, careful ones, letting her body register each mouthful before the next. The stew was venison with root vegetables and herbs she didn't know, richer than anything she'd eaten in years. The bread was dense and filling. She ate until she was satisfied, which was a sensation so unfamiliar it made her eyes sting. Jed settled across the hearth in his own chair with a book, and they sat in companionable silence while the fire burned and the wind moved around the outside of the cabin and found no way in. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said, eventually. "Seems to be your habit already. In the store today, why did you notice people see the bruises? They always look away." He was quiet for a while, his eyes on the fire. When he spoke, his voice was careful, as though handling something fragile. "My father drank," he said. "Preferred it to most other things. My mother tried to protect my sister and me, but she wasn't strong enough, and the town knew, and nobody did a damn thing. A pause. My sister died when she was 11. Took a beating meant for me and never woke up from it. Clara's breath left her. I left home that night, Jed continued, 14 years old. I told myself that if I ever saw someone in that same situation, I would not look away the way everyone else had. His eyes moved from the fire to her face. I saw you behind that counter, and I saw my sister. That's the whole of it. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind rose and fell. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. Not looking for sorry. His voice was gentle. Just answering your question. She held the warmth of the cabin around her and thought about what it meant that this man, this solitary, careful, weathered man, had carried that night with him for however many years it had been and had turned it into something other than bitterness. The loft's yours, Jed said, standing. Blankets up there, chamber pot under the bed. Fire will keep the heat rising through the night. He banked the coals with a practiced hand. Any questions? No, Clara said. No questions. She climbed the ladder to the loft. The bed was real, a mattress, not a pallet with pillows and wool blankets thick enough to sleep under, even in deep winter. She lay down and pulled them over her and listened to Jed moving around below, finishing the evening's task with his usual quiet efficiency, and felt something she had not felt in so long she barely recognized it. Safe. She closed her eyes and sleep took her, immediately pulling her down into a darkness so complete and so still that for the first time in 19 years, she did not dream at all. She woke to sunlight, not the tentative, fearful waking she had practiced for 19 years, that careful return to consciousness in which the first order of business was listening for her mother's mood before allowing herself to fully exist. This was different. The light came through the loft's small window at a low winter angle, laying a pale rectangle across the wool blanket, and Clara lay in it and breathed and did not feel afraid. The absence of fear was its own kind of presence, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire below. Below, she could hear movement, the scrape of a cast iron pot, the sound of water being poured. She climbed down the ladder to find Jed at the table with a book, a tin cup of coffee at his elbow. He looked up when she appeared. Morning, coffee's on the stove. She poured herself a cup and stood with it in both hands, absorbing the heat, looking around the cabin in the morning light. It looked different than it had the night before. Larger somehow, and more lived in the details visible, now that exhaustion hadn't been smoothing them away. A row of leather-bound journals on the middle shelf, a hat on a peg by the door battered and reshapen by weather into something uniquely its own. Snowshoes hung on the wall beside what she recognized as a crow blanket in deep reds and blacks, the pattern intricate and deliberate. What should I do? She asked. Jed set down his book. He looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read, patient, slightly amused, carrying something underneath that she couldn't name yet. Whatever you want, he said. Clara stared at him. I should help. I should be useful. You should eat breakfast first. He nodded toward the stove. Oats in the pot. Then you should rest. Explore if you want. Read. He paused. You don't have to earn your presence here, Clara. You are allowed to simply be. The concept was so foreign she didn't have immediate language for it. Simply be. As though existence itself were sufficient. As though she didn't have to justify every breath she took by demonstrating its value to someone else. I don't know how to do that, she admitted. Then you'll learn. He stood and pulled on his coat. I've got trap lines to check. I'll be back by afternoon. There's food in the cupboard and wood beside the stove. Come with me if you want. It's a long walk in deep snow. But the company's welcome. She didn't even hesitate. I'll come. He gave her a look that might have contained approval, then pointed to a pair of boots by the door, smaller than his, obviously kept for a purpose she didn't ask about yet. They spent the morning moving through the high country in a silence that was comfortable from the first 10 minutes, which surprised her. Clara had always associated silence with threat, the dangerous quiet before Eleanor's mood broke into weather. But this silence had a different quality, easy and companionable, punctuated by the sound of their boots in the snow and the occasional instruction from Jed about what to look for. He taught her as they walked. Animal tracks first, the small signature of a rabbit's gallop versus a squirrel's hop. The longer, deliberate prints of a fox, the surprising delicacy of a deer's passage through deep snow. He showed her how to reset a snare with the minimum of disturbance to the surrounding landscape, how to read the angle of shadows on north-facing slopes to judge the time without a watch. He spoke in the economical way of someone who had lived alone long enough that words had become genuinely precious, each one carrying its full weight, none wasted on decoration. Clara listened to everything. She asked questions when she had them and was silent when she didn't, and she noticed that Jed seemed to appreciate the distinction. Most men she had known were made uncomfortable by either by questions they found challenging or by silence they felt obliged to fill. Jed Calloway appeared to have made his peace with both. "You sell everything you trap?" she asked, as he reset a trap along the creek bed. "Trade it. Patterson's store in Iron Creek. I bring furs. He gives me credit for supplies." He brushed snow from his hands and straightened. "It's enough." "Don't you want more?" He considered the question with the same care he gave everything. "I've got shelter, food, freedom. What else matters?" She thought about that on the walk back. What else matters? It wasn't a question. She realized it was a statement, a determination. He had arrived at some fundamental accounting of his needs and found them satisfied, and the simplicity of that seemed to her both enviable and slightly alien, because she had never been permitted to take inventory of her own needs, let alone declare them met. They returned to the cabin in early afternoon with 2 rabbits and a beaver. Jed showed her how to skin and dress them at the work table outside the shed, his hands moving with efficient respect, quick, clean, no wasted motion, and no cruelty to it. Clara tried to suppress the discomfort she felt, and mostly succeeded. "You're doing fine," Jed said without looking up from his own work. "Take your time. My mother always said I was slow, clumsy. Your mother was wrong." He glanced over briefly. "You're careful. That's different." The distinction settled into her quietly the way good things did when she wasn't braced for them. Not with a rush, but with a kind of spreading warmth filling spaces that had been cold for so long, they'd forgotten they could be otherwise. That evening they ate together at the table fresh rabbit stew bread from the previous day, and Clara watched Jed across the fire-lit distance between their chairs, studying him the way she had always studied people who confused her, which was her habit when she needed to understand something she couldn't approach directly. He was older than she was by at least 20 years, she thought. His face was marked by that time in ways that most faces weren't. Not just lines, but a quality of density, as though living had compressed him into something harder and more durable than he'd started out. His hands were the hands of someone who had never been anything but physical, calloused, and scarred incompetent. He read in the evenings with the same total attention he brought to everything else, book held at a slight angle to catch the firelight, occasionally making small sounds of consideration that he seemed unaware of. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said. "You have asked me something every evening so far, starting to think it's your natural state." She almost smiled. "Why don't you have a family living up here alone? Don't you want—" "Had one," he said simply. "Wife died bringing our son into the world. The boy lived 2 days." He set the book down and looked at the fire. "That was 22 years ago. I came up here because I didn't trust myself around people after. Thought the mountain was safer." A pause. "For them and for me. But you do come down. You trade, you talk to people when it's necessary." His eyes moved from the fire to her face. "Doesn't mean I seek it. I had reasons for what I did and I made my peace with them. Until yesterday, anyway." The implication hung between them. Clara looked down at her bowl. "I'm not a problem for you to solve," she said carefully. "I need you to know that I understand the difference between I don't want to be a burden or a you're not." His voice was direct and even. "You're a person in a situation I recognized and could do something about. That's the entire thing." He picked up his book again. "The rest you'll work out as you go." She woke 3 days later to find 6 inches of new snow and Jed standing at the window watching it come down with an expression of professional assessment rather than concern. "Storm settling in," he said. "Could be a few days." Clara stood beside him and watched the white come down and felt something she hadn't felt since childhood, when snow had still been simply beautiful, rather than a threat to firewood supplies and travel times. She felt tentatively and with full awareness of how fragile it was, something like peace. "Then we better make sure there's enough wood inside," she said. He turned and looked at her with what she was beginning to recognize as his version of a smile, a slight deepening of the lines around his eyes, a barely perceptible softening of his expression. Now you're thinking like a mountain woman. They spent the morning hauling wood from the covered pile to stack inside near the door, working in companionable proximity, passing each other in the doorway, finding their rhythms without discussion. Clara liked the work. There was something satisfying about it that Eleanor's labor had never produced, perhaps because this time the work mattered, kept them both alive, and no one was keeping score. As the storm intensified, they retreated inside, and Jed produced a worn deck of cards from a tin on the shelf. He taught her 3 games she had never played, losing the first several rounds with no particular expression before winning the next several with the same face, which she found she enjoyed. They read aloud to each other in the afternoons. First Jed from a book about the settlement of the Oregon Territory, then Clara from a slim volume of essays on natural history that she found so compelling she kept interrupting herself to ask questions. Jed answered every one without impatience, which she had not expected, and when he didn't know an answer, he said so directly, which she had expected even less. On the third night of the storm, with the wind loud against the walls and the fire burned low and comfortable, Clara spoke into the darkness. "I'm glad you noticed me," she said. From his bedroll by the hearth, Jed was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you let it matter," he said. She lay in the loft above him and listened to the storm working against the cabin, and finding nothing, and for the first time in her life, she thought about the future without the particular dread that had always accompanied it. That sense of the future as simply an extension of the present. More of the same cold and the same fear and the same counting of bruises. She thought about what else it might be instead, what she might be instead. She did not yet have answers, but for the first time she had space to look for them, and that was enough, more than enough. She was beginning to understand everything. The storm broke on the 5th morning, leaving the world transformed and very still. Clara stood on the cabin porch in the thin winter sunlight and watched light move across the snow in slow gold sheets and thought, this is mine. This moment is mine. No one gave it to me, and no one can take it. She held on to that thought for 11 more days. It was Jed who came back from the far trap line with his face set in the particular way she had learned meant something was wrong. Not distressed, he didn't do distressed, but careful in the specific way he got when the situation required more attention than usual. "Tracks," he said, shrugging off his coat. "2 horses, maybe 3, coming up from the low country. They were circling the valley this morning." Clara set down the bread she was kneading. "Could be anyone. Trappers, hunters. Nobody comes up here in deep winter unless they're looking for something specific." He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, studying the tree line. "And nobody circles a valley. You circle when you're measuring." The cold that moved through her then had nothing to do with the temperature. "My mother. Possibly, or someone she sent." He turned from the window. "Either way, we need to think about what we do if someone official shows up. I'll tell them the truth. I came willingly. I can say that." "You can say it," Jed agreed. "But you're 19, she's your mother. I'm a man living alone in the mountains who paid money in exchange for you leaving her house. That story has a shape that some people will hear a certain way regardless of what you tell them." Clara's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "No," he said, "it's not." He looked at her directly. "If someone comes with a badge, any kind of law, you tell everything. All of it. You came voluntarily. You wanted to leave. I paid Eleanor for your labor, not for you. You understand the distinction." "I understand it." "Say it back to me." "He paid her to leave me alone," Clara said steadily. "That's different from buying me. Those are 2 different things." He nodded. "And if they try to take you anyway?" "I say I don't want to go." "Clearly," he said. Not politely. Clearly. They waited. The first day passed without incident. The second. Clara found herself listening to sounds she had not previously paid attention to, the specific quality of a horse's footfall versus a deer's, or the way wind in pine trees sounded different from wind-carrying riders. She did not know how Jed heard what he heard, but she was beginning to believe the stories about him, and some of them were beginning not to seem like stories at all. The men came on the 3rd day just after dawn. Clara heard the horses, first 3 of them, moving up the approach trail with no particular effort at concealment. She was feeding the fire when Jed appeared from the loft, already fully dressed, rifle in hand, but held low along his leg. "Stay visible," he said quietly, "but let me talk first." Through the window, she watched them come into the yard. The man in front wore a badge on his coat, catching the early light. The two behind him were different, broader, with the particular stillness of men who were paid to be where they were rather than where they wanted to be. One of them had a scar along his jaw that pulled his mouth slightly crooked. The other was watching the cabin with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. Jed opened the door before they knocked. "Deputy," his voice was even. "Help you?" The man with the badge had a tired face and careful eyes. "Name's Harlan Briggs, serving out of Iron Creek. I've got a complaint filed by one Eleanor Whitfield claiming her daughter was taken from her home against her will." He looked past Jed. "Was the girl here?" "The woman is here," Jed said. "She's 19, and she came with me voluntarily." Mrs. Whitfield's version is different. Mrs. Whitfield's version is whatever gets her daughter back under her roof. He stepped aside. "Clara." She moved to stand in the doorway. The morning air was cold on her face. She looked at Deputy Briggs, and she did not look at the two men behind him because she already understood they were a different kind of problem. "Miss Whitfield," Briggs said, "your mother filed a complaint saying this man took you from your home by force. Are you here of your own will?" "Yes," Clara said, "completely. You weren't coerced, not threatened, or—" "Mr. Calloway offered me a place to stay, and I accepted it." She kept her voice level. "My mother treated me poorly for my entire life. I chose to leave. He helped me do that." Briggs studied her with the professional attention of a man who had learned to distinguish between people telling the truth and people performing it. He looked at Jed. He looked back at Clara. "There was money exchanged," he said. "He paid my mother compensation for my years of labor," Clara said. "I worked for her without wages my whole life. He paid her what that was worth so she would let me leave without coming after me." She paused. Evidently, $50 wasn't enough to purchase her patience. One of the men behind Briggs, the one with the scar, made a sound that might have been a laugh and quickly wasn't. "I see," Briggs said. He looked at Jed again. "You understand the situation you have put yourself in, Calloway. Young woman, unmarried, living with a man, not her husband. Mrs. Whitfield is painting a particular picture." "Mrs. Whitfield is welcome to paint whatever she likes," Jed said. "The reality is that Clara came here because she had no safe alternative, and she stays because she chooses to." Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then, "Miss Whitfield, I need you to be very clear with me. Do you want to go home?" Clara looked past him at the mountains. At the valley floor, still half in shadow, the snow unmarked and clean. She thought about the cabin on the other side of that mountain, about the root cellar 3 days in the dark, age 16, about the coin she had earned and given back 10,000 times. "No," she said, "I do not want to go home." Briggs nodded slowly. He turned to write something in the small leather notebook he'd produced from his coat. "All right, that's plain enough for my report." He looked up at the two men behind him. "We're done here." The scarred man, she heard Briggs call him Dawson, took a step forward instead of back. "Hold on, we rode 2 days for this." "We rode 2 days to determine the girl's situation," Briggs said flatly. "Which is determined. Mrs. Whitfield paid good money for an escort," Briggs said, "not for anything else." Dawson's hand had drifted toward his hip without appearing to make a decision to do so. It was a habit, Clara thought, the hand finding the gun, the way a tongue finds a broken tooth. Maybe the girl doesn't fully understand what's good for her. Maybe she just needs a clearer picture of her options. Jed had not moved. His rifle was still low along his leg. But something had changed in the quality of his stillness, the way certain animals go still just before they move. "You take another step," he said quietly, "and I'll put you in the ground." Dawson stopped. The calculation behind his eyes was visible from where Clara stood. He looked at the rifle. He looked at Jed's face. He looked at the ground between them, measuring distances with the professional instincts of a man who had made these calculations before and understood their stakes. "Dawson!" Briggs's voice cracked like ice breaking. "Get on your horse." A long moment passed. Then Dawson turned slowly and went back to his horse. The other man, who had said nothing throughout, was already mounted. Briggs put away his notebook. He looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not sympathy exactly, but something adjacent to it. "My report will say you are safe and present voluntarily. That handles the legal side." He put his hat back on. "Miss Whitfield, Calloway." He turned his horse and the three of them rode back down the approach trail. Clara and Jed stood on the porch until the sound of hooves faded. "They'll come back," she said. "Dawson might." Jed's voice was flat. He didn't get paid what he was promised. Men like him don't forgive that easily. "What do we do?" "Stay alert. Keep the rifle loaded." He looked at her. "You'll learn to use it." She nodded. The morning had settled around them clean and cold, and somewhere beneath the relief of the deputy's departure was a harder knowledge this was not over. Eleanor had not taken her gold and let it go. Eleanor never let anything go. She had simply found a different way to reach. Clara looked out over the valley and felt the particular clarity that comes after a crisis passes and a larger one announces itself on the horizon. She had chosen this. She would have to be willing to defend it. "Then teach me," she said. Jed looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "After breakfast," he said. "Come inside." 3 days passed in a watchful calm. On the fourth day, the lessons began, not just with the rifle which Jed introduced first, with the same patient precision he brought to teaching her trap lines, but with everything. How to move through the trees without announcing herself. How to identify positions on high ground. How to read a landscape for cover and exposure. He taught without drama, treating danger as a practical problem, rather than an opportunity for fear, and Clara absorbed it all with the same focused hunger she brought to the reading and the cooking and the tracking. She was learning, she realized, not just survival skills, but something underneath them, a different relationship with her own capabilities. Every time she set a trap correctly, or identified an animal by its prints, or dry fired the rifle, and felt the mechanism respond to her touch, she was accumulating evidence against 19 years of testimony about what she was worth and what she was capable of. The evidence was piling up. Eleanor's testimony was losing its authority. On the fifth night, she woke at 2 a.m. with her lungs full of smoke. It took her 3 seconds to understand what she was smelling, not the familiar scent of banked coals, but something urgent and wrong, the kind of smoke that comes not from a fire contained, but from a fire that has escaped containment. She sat upright in the loft and saw orange light flickering through the boards beneath her feet. Jed. He was already moving below. She heard him hit the floor, heard the sharp economy of his movements, heard him say something she couldn't make out through the crackling. She was down the ladder in 4 seconds. The door was burning. The wood of the door frame had caught, and the fire was moving up it with a purposeful greed that told her immediately it had been set, not started accidentally. Through the gaps in the burning wood, she could see shapes moving in the darkness outside, figures unhurried, which was somehow worse than running would have been. "Dawson." Jed's voice was completely flat, which was the most frightening thing she had heard from him yet. He grabbed his rifle and 2 pouches of powder and shot. "Back window. Move. Everything. Move." He didn't say it harshly, but with a directness that cut through the shock of the moment. He was already at the back window, using the rifle butt to clear the glass, smoke pouring out into the dark morning's air. He helped her through first. The snow outside was knee-deep, and the cold hit her like a wall. She heard someone shout from the far side of the cabin. A gun went off. She felt the crack of it in her chest before she heard it in her ears, and something hit the log beside her shoulder with a sound like a hammer. Jed came through the window behind her, rolling, coming up with the rifle already to his shoulder. He fired once, twice. Something in the darkness made a sound. "The trees," he said, and took her arm. They ran. The tree line was 20 yards across open ground, which was 20 yards of exposure in the moonlight, and Clara ran with her whole body, committed to the idea of covering those yards, not looking back, not looking sideways, just the trees ahead and the snow sucking at her boots and her lungs screaming in the cold air. Behind her, she could hear shouts, the crack of another shot, the sound of Jed returning fire on the move. She hit the trees and kept going. Branches tore at her hair and her face. The darkness under the pines was total, and she navigated by the sound of Jed's footsteps and the broken quality of his breathing. Clara left the big pine. She saw it massive, centuries old, its base wide enough to provide real cover, and she dove behind it, pressing her back against the bark chest, heaving lungs burning with cold air. Jed appeared seconds later, breathing hard, blood running down the left side of his face from somewhere above his hairline. "You're hit." "Graze, I'm fine." He pressed himself against the tree beside her and risked a look around the trunk. 3 of them. Dawson and at least 2 others. They're spreading out. The cabin? She didn't finish. She could see it from here, the fire consuming the door frame and beginning to find the walls orange light, catching the snow and throwing it back in colors, beautiful in the way only destruction is beautiful. 12 years of Jed's life burning. Don't look at it, he said without looking at it himself. He pulled the pistol from his belt and held it toward her. She took it with both hands. The weight of it was strange and significant, heavier than she'd expected, heavier than it should have been for its size. 6 shots. Don't waste them. Don't shoot unless you're certain of your target. His eyes found hers in the dark. And if it comes to it, if it's you or them, you pull that trigger. You understand me? She looked at the pistol. She thought about the 19 years behind her and the open question of everything ahead. She thought about Eleanor's voice telling her she was worthless and Jed's voice telling her she was careful, and the difference between those two things. I understand, she said. From the darkness between the trees, Dawson's voice carried clearly, almost conversational. Calloway, send out the girl and we'll let you walk away from this. Mrs. Whitfield just wants her daughter back. No one needs to get hurt. Jed didn't answer. He was watching the shadows, reading them, the way he read snow and tracks and weather for information, for a pattern, for what they meant in what they were about to do. She must really hate you, Clara said quietly. She doesn't hate you, Jed said, equally quiet. She can't stand losing. Different thing entirely. He shifted slightly. They're east, moving slow, trying to come around our flank. Clara gripped the pistol and watched the darkness between the trees and waited. The forest was patient in a way that Dawson and his men were not. Clara had learned in the past several weeks what patience sounded like in the wilderness, the quality of silence in a waiting place, the particular stillness of things that had no reason to hurry. The men moving through the trees to the east of their position did not have that quality. They moved with the controlled urgency of men who were cold and angry and had been promised money that had not materialized, and she could track them by the small sounds of haste they couldn't help making. Jed tracked them, too. His whole body oriented toward the sounds the way a compass needle orients toward north. Not obviously, not dramatically, just with that total economical attention he brought to everything. The one on the far left, he said quietly, moving faster than he should be. Clara looked. She couldn't see him, but she could hear the difference. He was describing a slightly more aggressive displacement of snow, a pace that was trying to cover ground instead of preserve silence. He wants to end this quickly, she said. He wants to get warm. Jed didn't take his eyes off the darkness. Cold men make mistakes. We wait. She waited. The fire behind them was eating the cabin in earnest now. The sound of it, a low roar that she felt more in her chest than heard with her ears, and she made herself not think about what was burning, the books on the shelves, the crow blanket, the small wooden carving of a bear that sat on the windowsill that she had asked about and Jed had told her Standing Elk had made. She made herself think instead about the present moment, about the weight of the pistol in her hand and the cold of the snow through her boots, and the exact quality of the sounds moving through the trees to the east. The man came into the open. He was moving low and fast, angled toward their tree, and he was 10 yards out when Jed fired. The sound cracked through the forest, and the man spun and went down with a cry that told her he was wounded rather than dead, and then gunfire opened up from 2 directions simultaneously, and bark exploded from the pine trunk 6 inches above her head. Move, Jed said and had her arm. They ran again, not back toward the cabin, which was fully involved now, but deeper into the forest, cutting across the slope at an angle that Jed clearly knew, and she was trusting him to know, crashing through undergrowth and around boulders and over the small creek that had been frozen solid enough to run across. Behind them, voices, the sound of men who were now angry rather than careful, which made them louder, but not necessarily more dangerous. Here, Jed pulled her down behind a fallen log, a big one, a spruce that had come down in some past storm, and lay along the ground like a wall, its root ball rising 6 feet on the uphill side. Good position, clear sight lines on the approach. If they want us, they'll have to cross open ground. Clara pressed herself against the log and tried to slow her breathing, which was coming in ragged pulls that she was afraid were too loud. The cold was working into her now, through the exertion, finding the gaps between clothing and skin settling in. She was aware of her feet in a way she hadn't been before, the wet cold of snow inside her boots, the beginning of numbness in her toes. How many shots do you have left? She asked. Enough. He was reloading with practiced efficiency in the dark by feel. The one I hit, he's out of it. That leaves two, plus whoever Dawson brought as additional. Possibly. He risked a look over the log. Can't tell yet. She thought about Deputy Briggs, who had gone back to Iron Creek. She thought about whether he had heard the gunfire, whether sound carried that far in cold mountain air, and she thought about how long it would take someone to ride up from town, even if he had. Too long. She understood that with perfect clarity. Nobody was coming. Whatever happened in these trees in the next hour was between them and the men their mother had hired, and the outcome would be decided by the same brutally simple arithmetic that had always governed the high country's skill and luck and the will to survive. They'll try to wait us out, Jed said. Freeze us or flush us. So we don't let them wait. He looked at her. That's not what I know it's not what you were going to say. She met his gaze in the dark, this man who had made his whole life in this wilderness and whose instinct in a crisis was to protect rather than use. But you can't watch every direction at once. I'm not a liability, Jed. You taught me. Use what you taught me. A long pause. The fire behind them sent a column of orange light into the sky above the ridge, illuminating the clouds from below, like dawn breaking in the wrong direction. They'll try to flank us, he said finally. If one comes from the east and draws my attention, the other comes from the west. She finished the sentence. I watch the west. If someone comes at you, you wait until they're close enough that missing isn't a reasonable option. You don't warn them. You don't talk. His voice was absolutely even. You pull the trigger. I know. Clara. He said her name with a weight that made her look at him. If something happens to me, if I can't, you run. You take the pistol and you run south along the creek bed. You follow the creek down until you hit the main road, and you keep going until you reach a farm or a homestead. You understand nothing's going to happen to you. That's not an answer. Yes, she said, I understand. He nodded, and then very quietly, as though it cost him something, you're braver than you know. Before she could respond, Dawson's voice came out of the darkness again, closer now, and from a different direction he'd moved while they were talking, working his way around. Last chance, Calloway. The girl walks out on her own, or we come and get her. You want to die on this mountain over a woman who's not even yours? Jed said nothing. He was watching the east, which told Clara that Dawson was somewhere west or south, and she turned her attention in that direction, scanning the darkness between the trees for movement. She heard him before she saw him. A soft compression of snow, slightly too regular for an animal, slightly too careful for a man who wasn't trying to be careful. She tracked the sound, building a picture of position and movement in her mind, the way Jed had taught her to build pictures from tracks. Not the thing itself, but what the evidence said about the thing. He was coming from the northwest, moving slow, very close. Clara steadied the pistol with both hands. Her arms were shaking cold in fear and the sheer strangeness of what she was doing, but her hands were steady, the way her hands had always steadied when the situation demanded it. She had a theory about this, which was that her body had spent 19 years learning to suppress its natural responses under pressure, and that this particular skill developed in Eleanor's kitchen was now serving her in a Wyoming forest, which was not the application anyone would have designed it for, but was the application it was getting. The man stepped into a gap between the trees where the firelight reached just far enough to give her a shape, a silhouette, a direction. Clara fired. The shot was loud enough to blank out her hearing entirely for a moment. The man cried out, and she heard him go down in the snow, and she heard Jed fire twice in quick succession from the other side of the log, and she heard a sound of impact, and then a silence that was different from the silence that had preceded it, and then nothing. The forest was still. The fire behind them was still burning. Somewhere in the middle distance, a horse was moving, the sound of it growing fainter rather than closer. She realized she was still holding the pistol with both hands. She lowered it slowly. Jed, here. His voice came from directly behind her, closer than she expected. He appeared around the end of the log, and she could see in the firelight that the blood on the side of his face had dried and that he was moving carefully, one hand pressed against his left side. You're hit. The second one got off a shot before he stopped and breathed. It's not bad. That is not what your face says. My face says it hurts. That's different from bad. He looked at her, and his expression in the firelight was something she hadn't seen from him before. Unguarded, almost unsteady, the composure worn thin. The one you shot. He's down. I know. You all right? Clara looked at the pistol in her hand. She waited to feel what she thought she was supposed to feel. Horror guilt, the particular weight of having taken a life. What she felt instead was a hollow exhaustion, and underneath that, something hard and clean that she didn't have a word for yet. Not satisfaction, not pride, something more fundamental. The knowledge that she had been in a situation where the choice was her life or someone else's, and she had made the choice, and she was still here. I'm all right, she said. You need to sit down. I need to, Jed. She moved to him and took his arm, and the quality of how much he let her take it told her everything about how much pain he was actually in. You need to sit down and let me look at it. Everything else is secondary. He sat down against the fallen log. The snow around him was dark in a way she didn't let herself look at directly. She got his coat open and his shirt pulled back and found the wound a deep graze along his left ribs that was more than a graze and less than a penetration, which meant it had done damage without doing the worst kind of damage, which was the precise, narrow margin between bad and worse. Bullet's still in there, he said. I can see that. You'll need to cut it out. His voice was matter of fact, which was either very brave or very frightening, or possibly both. I know. She looked at him steadily. Walk me through it. What followed was the most difficult 40 minutes of her life, including 19 years of Eleanor's household, which she had previously believed represented the ceiling of what she was capable of enduring. She built a small fire cover was more important than concealment. Now warmth more important than both heated the small knife from Jed's pack and did what he told her to do with it, following his instructions through the parts where he couldn't speak, and continuing when he could again working by the fire's uncertain light with hands that she would not permit to shake. The bullet came out clean. She packed the wound with strips torn from the lining of her coat. She had nothing better, and bound it tight, and when she was finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at Jed, who had gone gray and still, and waited for him to breathe. He breathed. Done, she said. Good girl. His voice was barely above a whisper. Good. Don't call me girl, she said, which surprised them both into something that was almost a laugh. Good woman, he corrected and closed his eyes. She kept the fire going. She sat beside him with the pistol across her knees, and she watched the forest and waited for dawn, which came eventually the way dawn always does, reluctantly in stages, the dark becoming less dark, becoming gray, becoming a cold pale gold that turned the snow to pewter and then to white. Jed was still alive. She checked his breathing every half hour, and it was getting stronger rather than weaker, which was the direction she required. In the full light of morning, she could see the extent of what Dawson's ambush had cost them. The cabin was a ruin, the walls still standing, but blackened, the roof partly collapsed, the interior reduced to ash, and the remnants of things that had been part of a life. She did not go look at it closely. She sat beside Jed and kept the fire going, and watched the approach trail with the steady, particular attention of a woman who had decided that whatever came next would not find her unprepared. She heard the horse at mid-morning, one horse moving at a reasonable pace rather than in a hurry, and from the approach trail rather than the trees, both of which were good signs. She stood up and positioned herself where she could see without being exposed, pistol in hand, and waited. The rider who came into view wore a silver badge on his coat. Deputy Briggs. He came into the clearing and stopped when he saw her and looked at the ruins of the cabin and then at her and at the gun in her hand, and his tired eyes moved through the scene with the practiced efficiency of a man who had developed the ability to read a situation quickly. Miss Whitfield. He looked at the cabin again. I heard the shots. We all did. The whole valley heard them. He dismounted. Where's Calloway? Here. Jed's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him on his feet, moving slowly but upright, one hand braced against the log. His face was still gray, and the set of his jaw told her what the effort was costing him. Deputy, hell of a night you had, Briggs said. He looked around the clearing, the places where the snow was disturbed, the dark patches, the evidence. Dawson and whoever he brought with him. 3 of them came, Clara said. One of them somewhere east of here. The one who came at me is... She stopped. I'll find them, Briggs said flatly. He looked at Jed. You need a doctor. I need a day to sleep, Jed said. After that, I'll be fine. You'll go into Iron Creek and see the doctor, or I'll carry you there myself. Briggs's voice was flat and absolute. He turned to Clara. Your mother's name is on this. When I get back to town, I'm going to have a conversation with her that she is not going to enjoy. She'll deny it, Clara said. She can deny it all she wants. I've got two, possibly three dead men on a mountain who came up here on her money and a man with a bullet wound and a burned homestead. The Whitfield's denials are not going to carry the weight she thinks they will. He put his hat back on. Can you ride? Yes, Clara said. Both of you town now. He looked at the ruins of the cabin and something moved across his face that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but was in the vicinity of both. I'll send someone back up for the cleanup. She helped Jed onto Briggs's horse, which Briggs surrendered without discussion, and led by the bridle, and they moved down the mountain toward Iron Creek in the pale winter light, with the smoke of what had been a home rising straight up behind them in the still cold air. Clara rode with her back straight and her face forward, and she did not look back at the smoke, not because it didn't hurt, but because she had made a decision somewhere in the night, somewhere between the shot and the dawn about what she was going to carry and what she was going to leave behind. She carried Jed. She carried the pistol. She carried the knowledge of what she'd done and the harder knowledge of why, and she carried the shawl that had been her grandmother's and was now hers, which was the only thing she had brought out of her old life that she'd chosen to keep. Everything else she left for the fire. Iron Creek in winter was a different town than it was in summer, stripped of the casual sociability that warm weather encouraged and reduced to its essential function: shelter against the elements, commerce against necessity, community against the particular loneliness of mountain living. The buildings along Main Street looked smaller in December, hunkered down under their snow loads, smoke rising from every chimney in thin, parallel lines. Clara had lived her entire life within 3 hours of this town and had always experienced it as enemy territory, a place where Eleanor's performance of the concerned mother could be staged before an audience that was too polite or too indifferent to question the casting. She rode into it now behind Deputy Briggs. Jed mounted on the deputy's horse with the careful economy of a man in significant pain and felt the town's attention shift toward them, the way attention always shifts toward the arrival of something unusual. Dr. Emmett Graves was a compact man in his 50s who had come to Iron Creek 20 years earlier for reasons he had never explained, and had since become the kind of community institution that makes it impossible to remember what came before it. He received Jed Calloway with neither surprise nor excess ceremony, took one look at Clara's field dressing, said "not bad work" in a tone that suggested he meant it, and proceeded to do the things that required more than a mountain field kitchen and strips torn from a coat lining. Clara sat in the waiting room of the small building that served as the doctor's office, surgery, and occasionally residence, and looked at her hands. They were clean, she had washed them twice, but she was still aware of them in an unusual way, as though they had become slightly unfamiliar to her in the past 12 hours. She had done things with these hands that she would not have predicted for herself. She was trying to understand how she felt about that. She felt mostly that she was still here. Mr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway 20 minutes after they arrived, his round face carrying the expression of a man who has been told something and is trying to decide what to do with it. He had a package under one arm. Clara, he set the package on the chair beside her. Edna, my wife, she sent some things. Dry clothes, something to eat. He sat down across from her, folding his hands in his lap. I heard what happened. Word travels fast. In this town, it always does. He was quiet for a moment. I want to say something to you, and I hope you'll let me say it plainly. Go ahead. I knew about your mother. I've known for years about what she was doing. He met her eyes, and what was in his was not comfortable. I didn't do anything. I told myself it wasn't my place. It was family business. There was nothing to be done. All the things people tell themselves. He paused. I'm sorry for that. I should have done something years ago. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it would have cost him, what it would have cost any of them in this small town to insert themselves between Eleanor Whitfield and her daughter. She thought about what it would have meant to her if someone had. Thank you for saying it, she said, or it's not enough. No, she agreed, but it's something. He nodded and left, and she opened the package and found a wool dress in brown and gray dry stockings, a wrapped piece of cornbread, and a small jar of honey. She changed behind the screen in the corner and ate the cornbread slowly and thought about what came next, which was a thing she had been avoiding thinking about because it had too many variables. and she was too tired to manage all of them at once. Dr. Graves appeared in the doorway an hour later. "He'll be fine," he said. "I want to keep him here for 2 days minimum. The wound was well tended, better than it had any right to be, but he's lost blood and he needs to be still." He looked at her with the directness of a man who has decided opinions on most things and is not particularly interested in performing politeness. "You did that field dressing. He told me what to do." "He told you, you did it. There's a difference." He tilted his head slightly. "You have people here somewhere to stay." She was about to say she didn't know when Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway behind him, slightly out of breath, as though she'd walked quickly and was not going to admit it. "She'll stay with us," Mrs. Patterson said. The statement allowed no discussion. "Henry, is Jed going to live?" "He is," Dr. Graves said. "Good. Come along, Clara." She produced a coat from somewhere. It was large and warm and smelled of cedar and cinnamon, and handed it over with the efficiency of someone who has been providing practical solutions to difficult situations for a very long time. "You need a bath, a real meal, and approximately 12 hours of sleep, and you're going to get all three." Clara stood up. The floors seemed slightly less stable than usual, which was her body's way of informing her that the previous 24 hours had accumulated and were now presenting their bill. "What about my mother?" she asked. "Deputy Briggs went to speak to her this morning," Mrs. Patterson said. "Henry, has there been news?" "I heard Ashtian." Dr. Graves said carefully that Mrs. Whitfield was not at her homestead when the deputy arrived. "Her neighbor Turnbull, the man with the sheep, says she loaded a wagon 2 days ago and headed east on the main road." The information landed strangely. Clara had braced for another confrontation, had been holding herself ready for it, the way you hold yourself ready for a blow that you've learned to expect from a certain direction. She had not braced for absence. "She left," Clara said. "Appears so." She stood in the waiting room of Dr. Graves's surgery in Iron Creek and absorbed this information. Eleanor Whitfield, who had controlled every inch of Clara's existence for 19 years, who had hired men to drag her back by force, who had, when the force failed, apparently simply left, taken her gold and her wagon and gone east without a word, without a confrontation, without even the satisfaction of a final scene. What she felt was not relief and not grief, but something in between, a strange, hollow quality, as though she had prepared a speech for someone who had already left the room. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you." She stayed with the Pattersons for 3 days. Mrs. Patterson fed her with the thorough, slightly aggressive generosity of a woman who had decided that someone needed feeding and was going to see it done, and asked nothing of her except that she eat and sleep and exist without fear, which was, Clara was finding, a more complex requirement than it appeared. The habit of vigilance was hard to suspend, even when there was nothing to be vigilant against. She kept waking in the night, listening for sounds that weren't there, rehearsing responses to situations that weren't coming. She visited Jed twice each day. The first visit, he was asleep, and she sat in the chair beside his bed and watched him breathe, which was enough. The second day, he was awake, his color better, the gray quality gone from his face and replaced by something that was still pale, but looked more like recovery than depletion. "You could have run," he said on the second afternoon, "when Dawson came for us. You could have taken the pistol and gone south along the creek like I told you. You told me to do that if something happened to you. Something did happen to me. You were still breathing." She looked at him steadily. "That doesn't count." He was quiet for a moment. The winter light came through the surgery's small window and lay across the blanket in a pale rectangle. And outside on the street, she could hear the ordinary sounds of a town going about its business. "You shot a man to keep me alive," he said. "Yes." "How are you with that?" It was the question she had been carrying since the forest, turning it over, looking at its edges. She had spent 2 nights lying in the Patterson's spare room trying to find the honest answer. "I'm not sorry," she said. "I think I should be, and I'm not. I know what he was going to do, and I know why I did what I did, and when I try to find regret, I find something else instead." She paused. "I find that I chose, and that the choice was mine, and that it came out the way I needed it to come out." She met Jed's eyes. "I don't know what that says about who I am." "I know what it says," Jed said. "It says you're someone who, when it came to it, valued your own life enough to defend it." He held her gaze. "Most people don't find that out about themselves until it's too late to be useful. You're not troubled by it. Dawson made his choices, you made yours. His voice was simple and complete. The math isn't complicated. She exhaled. Something she had been holding released slightly. My mother left, she said, packed up and went east, apparently, before Briggs could talk to her. I know, he told me this morning. I came here to face her, to say it to her face that I wasn't afraid anymore, and she's just gone. Is that the worst outcome? Clara thought about it. No, she admitted. It might be the best one. I just wasn't ready for it. Sometimes people leave because staying means having to look at what they've done. Jed shifted carefully and she saw the wince he was suppressing. Eleanor's not stupid. She knew what she sent those men to do. She knew what it made her. Facing you means facing that. Easier to go east. I wanted the confrontation, Clara said. I wanted to see her understand that it didn't work, that she couldn't have me back. She already understands that, Jed said. The confrontation would have been for you, and there are other ways to finish it. She thought about that on the walk back to the Pattersons' house through the cold, quiet streets of Iron Creek in the late afternoon. He was right, she thought. The confrontation she had wanted was a ceremony more than a necessity, a formal acknowledgement of a change that had already happened, that had happened in the snow outside the Whitfield cabin when she had said no and meant it, and again into the forest when she had pulled a trigger to defend something worth defending. Eleanor's presence or absence couldn't ratify or revoke what Clara had already done. The change had happened inside her, and Eleanor was not required. On the evening of the third day, Mr. Patterson knocked on the door of the spare room. There's someone to see you, he said, in the parlor. She came downstairs to find Deputy Briggs sitting in the Pattersons' parlor with his hat in his hands and an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something slightly less official than his usual bearing, as though the badge had been loosened, if not removed. Miss Whitfield, he rose. Or I should probably ask, what do you prefer I call you? Clara is fine. Clara, he turned his hat. I wanted to give you a report. What happened on the mountain there will be a formal inquiry, required procedure, but the inquiry isn't going to go anywhere difficult for you or Calloway. The men Dawson brought were wanted in 2 other counties. The one who was wounded left blood across half the mountain and walked into the general store in Harker's Flat with a bullet still in his shoulder 3 days later, and he told the whole story before the doctor even got to him. The corner of Briggs' mouth moved slightly. He wasn't apparently a man of high discretion. And Dawson, dead. He said it plainly without drama. I need to ask you formally to confirm that the shooting was in defense of your person and Calloway's life. For the record. It was, she said, completely and without hesitation. He nodded and made a note. Your mother's whereabouts are currently unknown. I have a request into the county east of here. Whether anything comes of that, he spread his hands. I wouldn't count on it. She didn't technically commit a crime herself. Hiring men to escort her daughter home is a gray area, particularly since you're technically a minor in some interpretations, and she is technically your legal guardian. I'm 19. I know, but the law doesn't always. It's complicated. He met her eyes. What I can tell you is that I will make it very difficult for her to return to Iron Creek and pursue any claim against you. That I can do, and I intend to. Thank you, Clara said. She meant it differently than she usually meant it when she said thank you to men in official positions, not with the careful performance of gratitude designed to preserve goodwill, but with something simpler and more direct. He had done more than his job required, and they both knew it. After he left, she sat in the Pattersons' parlor and listened to the fire and thought about what happened next. Jed was released from Dr. Graves's care on the 4th day, moving stiffly but independently, and they stood together in the cold outside the surgery on Main Street, while Iron Creek went about its business around them with the pleasant indifference of a town that has already absorbed the interesting parts of a story and returned to ordinary life. The cabin's gone, Clara said. Most of it. He looked at her steadily. I can rebuild. We, she said. He looked at her, and she held the look without flinching. We can rebuild, if that's what you want. He was quiet for a moment. A wagon went past on the street. The smith's hammer rang from somewhere down the block. It's what I want, he said. Then that's what we'll do. She was aware as she said it that she was standing in the middle of the main street of Iron Creek in broad daylight, making decisions about her own future and her own life in her own voice and her own words with no one's permission sought or required. The awareness of it was not dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was simply a fact, quiet and enormous, and entirely hers. There's a matter of where to stay while we do it, Jed said. The slight formality in his tone told her he'd been thinking about this. The Pattersons offered for as long as needed. I know, and there's the question of, he paused. People are talking, Patterson told me. People have always talked about me, Clara said. They talked about my mother's poor, battered daughter for years and never did anything about it. They can talk about whatever they like now. It doesn't change anything that actually matters. He studied her. You've gotten harder. Clearer, she said. There's a difference, Mom. He almost smiled. They spent 3 weeks at the Pattersons while Jed's wound closed properly, and Clara helped Mrs. Patterson in the store and the kitchen and read every book on the single shelf in the spare room twice. She wrote a letter to a woman named Catherine in Philadelphia, who she had been told was her father's sister. She found the address through a circuitous process involving a letter among Eleanor's few remaining effects that Turnbull the neighbor had recovered from the empty cabin. She didn't know if the letter would reach anyone. She sent it anyway. She also had a conversation with Mr. Hargrove that she had been avoiding for reasons she understood when she finally had it, because having it required her to know what she wanted, which was still a foreign exercise. I want to learn to read better, she told him. Write properly. I want to understand mathematics. I want to know history. She had made a list, and she read from it, which was partly nervousness and partly the fact that she had made the list carefully and wanted to honor it. I want to know about the world beyond these mountains. Hargrove looked at her across his counter with the expression of a man recalibrating something. There's a school teacher in Millbridge, he said finally, 20 miles east. Woman named Hartley. She takes adult students on Saturday mornings. He paused. Patterson's got books, more than what's on the shelf in the spare room. I've been ordering them in for years. Don't ask me why this town doesn't read as much as it should. They're yours if you want them. She went to Millbridge the following Saturday. The school teacher, Martha Hartley, was a direct woman of 40-something with ink-stained fingers and the particular pleasure in learning that some people have instead of religion. She looked Clara over, once asked her 3 questions and said, "Come back next week, bring a notebook." On the walk back to Iron Creek, 17 miles through winter landscape, that was beautiful in the specific way that difficult things are beautiful, Clara thought about what she was building. Not just the cabin on the mountain, though she was already thinking about that, already planning the better drainage and the sight lines in the second room that the original hadn't had. But the other structure, the inner one, the one that couldn't be burned down because it was made of things Eleanor had tried to take from her and hadn't managed to her desire to learn, her ability to feel joy in ordinary things, her stubborn and persistent conviction, even at the bottom of 19 years of evidence to the contrary, that she was worth something. That conviction, it turned out, had not been wrong. It had just been waiting. They began work on the new cabin in early March when the snow had softened enough to allow it. Jed had bought lumber from the mill in Millbridge, on credit extended by Patterson, who appeared to have decided that being on the right side of this particular story was good for business, if nothing else. They took the horse and the borrowed wagon up the mountain on the first clear day, and Jed stood in the ruins of what had been and pointed to a spot 40 yards north and higher on the slope. There, he said, better drainage, better approach line. He looked at her. What do you think? He had been doing this increasingly over the past weeks, asking what she thought before he told her what he thought and then actually listening to her answer. She was not yet fully accustomed to it. She suspected she might not be fully accustomed to it for a long time, and that the discomfort of it was also a kind of measure. I think, she said, looking at the spot, that we should put the window on the south wall instead of the east. More light in the afternoons. And in winter, the sun is lower, he said. It'll help with heat. Yes, he nodded. They walked to the spot together and stood on it and looked out over the valley, and Clara thought, this is mine. Not just mine, ours, but mine in a way that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with choice. She had chosen this mountain and this valley and this man and this life, and the choosing had made it hers in a way that simply being born into a place never had. We should get started, she said. We should, he agreed, and they did. The new cabin rose through March and into April, log by log, day by day, in the particular way that things built with intention and patience tend to rise not quickly but solidly, each piece placed with an understanding of what it was supporting. Clara had never built anything before. She had repaired things, patched, mended, made do, but building from the ground up was different. It required thinking forward, imagining the finished thing before it existed, deciding now about problems that wouldn't present themselves until later. Jed taught her this the same way he had taught her everything else, by doing it beside her and explaining what he was doing, and why, then gradually stepping back and letting her do it herself and answering questions when she had them. She had a great many questions. Why do you cut this joint this way instead of that way? Why does the chimney need to sit here and not there? Tuh. If we set this course of logs 2 inches lower, wouldn't the door frame be more tall? It would, Jed would say, but then the bomb, and they would work it out together, standing in the cold with their hands on rough wood, talking through the geometry of shelter, like two people working out a shared language. Which she realized on a day in early April when the south wall was standing and they were planning the roof was exactly what it was, a shared language. They had been building it since the first morning she had come down the loft ladder to find coffee on the stove and a man reading a book, and what they were building now out of timber and sweat was simply the physical expression of something that had been taking shape for much longer. A letter arrived from Philadelphia in April. She read it twice, standing in the Pattersons' kitchen where it had been left with the other mail, then walked up to the building site and sat down on a pile of lumber and read it a third time. The woman named Catherine Brennan had written back. She wrote carefully and warmly, introducing herself as the younger sister of James Whitfield, who had been Clara's father, whose name Clara had never heard Eleanor speak, she realized, in her entire life. Catherine wrote about her brother, about the kind of man he had been, gentle, she said, and patient, with a love of music and books and the particular tenderness of people who are strong enough not to need to perform it. She wrote that he had gone west, seeking something she couldn't quite name, some need for space and sky that the East couldn't provide, and that he had written her letters about Wyoming that made it sound like a place from a dream. He had mentioned Eleanor in those letters. He had loved her. Catherine wrote carefully, very much. Clara folded the letter and held it for a moment. Jed came around the corner of the south wall with a beam over his shoulder and stopped when he saw her face. "News," he said. "My father's sister." She held up the letter. She wrote back. He set the beam down and came and sat beside her on the lumber pile, and she read him the relevant parts, which turned out to be most of it. He listened without interrupting, which was another of his qualities she had cataloged and valued. "She wants to know me," Clara said. "She says I'm welcome to come east if I ever want to, or if I want to correspond, she'll write regularly." She paused. "She says she can tell me things about my father." "Do you want that?" She looked out over the valley. The snow was nearly gone from the lower slopes, now the brown of last year's grass showing through in patches, with the first green beginning to appear at the edges of the creek. "Yes," she said. "I think I do. I think I've been missing something I never got to have and didn't know I was missing." She turned the letter in her hands. She's the only person left who knew him. Then write back. "I will." She refolded the letter carefully and tucked it into her coat. She mentioned my mother, said Eleanor had written to her before she left Montana, asking. Catherine doesn't know why she wrote. She said the letter was strange and disjointed, but she wrote. Jed was quiet. Eleanor knew she was doing something she couldn't undo, Clara said, when she hired Dawson. She knew that if it went wrong, and she must have known there was a real chance it would go wrong, there was no coming back from it. Not to Iron Creek, not to the life she'd had. She paused. Part of me thinks she wanted it to go wrong. Why, Basayan? Because she was exhausted, because keeping that much cruelty maintained for 19 years is its own kind of prison. She looked at her hands. I'm not forgiving her. I want to be clear about that. What she did was not forgivable, and I'm not going to perform forgiveness because it's the expected thing. She paused. But I think I understand her. A little. And understanding doesn't cost me as much as I thought it would. Jed put his hand over hers briefly, then stood and picked up the beam again. Let's get the roof framing started, he said. I want to get the north section up before the afternoon. She stood up. And after that, he said, we figure out the floor plan for the second room. She smiled, which she was doing more frequently and with less surprise at herself each time. Lead on. The roof was on by the end of April. The walls were chinked and sealed through most of May. They were sleeping in the new cabin, a real cabin with a proper loft and a south-facing window that let the afternoon light in exactly as Clara had planned. By the time the high country summer arrived in earnest green and gold and impossibly clear after the long white of winter. Clara wrote to Catherine every 2 weeks. Catherine wrote back with the regularity of someone who has found an unexpected gift and is determined to treat it carefully. Through those letters, Clara assembled a picture of a man she had never known, her father James Whitfield, who had been funny and serious in equal measure, who had made wooden toys for neighborhood children in Philadelphia, who had loved mountains because Catherine said they reminded him that the world was larger than whatever current trouble occupied it. She kept the letters in the leather journal Jed had given her for the previous Christmas, along with the other things she was collecting, pressed flowers from the South Meadow, a hawk feather she had found on the ridge above the new cabin, a page of arithmetic she had worked out correctly on the first try in Martha Hartley's Saturday class, which she had been attending every week for 4 months and which had become one of the fixed points around which she organized her sense of herself. She was learning. Not just the practical things that the mountain had been teaching her since the beginning, tracking trapping, reading the seasons, understanding the language of weather, but the other thing, the ones Eleanor had decided she didn't deserve. She was learning to read with real comprehension rather than just decoding words. She was learning to write in complete considered sentences that said what she meant. She was learning history and geography and the basics of natural science, and she was discovering, to a pleasure that still surprised her, that she was good at these things, that her mind worked quickly and held information and connected ideas in ways that Martha Hartley said were unusual. "You have a natural facility for pattern recognition," Martha said one Saturday, looking at a page of exercises Clara had completed. "You see how things relate to each other. That's not something I can teach. It's something you came with." Clara thought about Eleanor telling her she was stupid, that reading was a waste of time, that the only thing she'd ever been good for was fetching water and sweeping floors. She thought about those words carefully, the way you handle something that has been sharp for a long time and test it to see whether it still cuts. It cut less than it used to. The blade was dulling. She mentioned this to Jed that evening, and he listened with the quality of attention she had come to depend on, complete and unperformative, as though whatever she said were genuinely interesting to him, which she was beginning to believe it was. "I keep waiting," she said, "to feel like a person with a path that defines them. Like Eleanor's daughter, like a woman who spent her childhood being told she was worthless. I keep waiting to be that person." "Are you by less and less?" She looked at the fire. Does that seem wrong to you, that I'm not carrying it more heavily? What would be the point of carrying it more heavily?" She thought about that. "I don't know, to honor it maybe, to not pretend it didn't happen." "You're not pretending it didn't happen," he said. "You know it happened. You know what it cost you. You're just deciding not to let that cost be the most important thing about you." He picked up his book. "That's not dishonesty. That's choosing what to build with." Summer turned toward fall, and fall toward the particular quality of Wyoming October that had always seemed to Clara to be the most purely itself of all the seasons, that combination of gold light and cold air, and the smell of wood smoke, and the sense of the world preparing itself for something. She planted a garden that summer with seeds from Mrs. Patterson and advice from 3 different women who had been growing things in mountain soil for decades, and harvested it in September with the particular satisfaction of someone who has made something from nothing and eaten it for dinner. She shot her first deer that October, a doe on the south slope of the ridge in the early morning. She did it cleanly and quickly and processed the carcass with Jed's guidance, and felt when it was done the same thing she had felt after other difficult firsts. Not pride exactly, but the quiet accumulation of evidence about what she was capable of, the internal ledger growing steadily more substantial on the side of competence. She was becoming, she thought herself, not the self Eleanor had tried to construct, useful and small and afraid, but the one that had apparently been waiting underneath that construction the whole time, patient as the mountain, ready for the moment someone took the weight off. It was in October, sitting on the porch of the new cabin in the last of the afternoon light, that Jed said something that had been building between them for months. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You're allowed. I want to ask you carefully because I don't want to get it wrong." He was looking out over the valley, not at her, which was how he looked when he was being honest about something difficult. What we have here, what we've built. Yes, she said. I'm 20 years older than you. I've lived hard and I carry that. I'm not, he stopped, started again. I don't have a lot to offer that a younger man couldn't offer better. You have this, she said. This is mine and yours both. That's not something I'm giving you. It's something we made. That's exactly my point, she said. He finally looked at her. In the October light, his face was all the things it had always been. Weathered, careful, difficult to read except in the ways that she had learned to read it, plus something else, something she recognized as the particular vulnerability of a man who has spent a long time not wanting things and has been surprised into wanting something again. I'm asking if you'd be willing, he said, to make this permanent, in the eyes of the town and the law and whatever else wants to have an opinion about it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the girl who had carried water buckets in the cold and flinched at every raised hand and had been told daily and in many different voices that she was worth nothing and deserved less. She thought about the woman who had cut a bullet from this man's side in a forest in winter and kept a fire going until dawn and ridden into Iron Creek with her back straight and her eyes forward and her grandmother's shawl around her shoulders. She thought about choosing. I would be very willing, she said. They were married in November in the Iron Creek church on a day when the first real snow of the season was falling in fat, unhurried flakes that made the whole town look like something from a story. The ceremony was simple and attended by more people than Clara had expected, not just the Pattersons and Dr. Graves and Deputy Briggs, but a dozen families she had known at a careful distance her whole life, people who had looked away when Eleanor was cruel and were now, it seemed, choosing to be present for something else. Mrs. Patterson had made a cake. Mr. Hargrove had arranged for the use of the back room of his store as a reception space and decorated it with pine boughs and candles. Martha Hartley came down from Millbridge and pressed Clara's hands and said, "Keep coming on Saturdays. This doesn't change anything about that." Clara stood in the middle of it and felt tentatively, and then with increasing confidence, something she recognized as belonging, not the belonging of someone who has always been part of something and takes it for granted, the belonging of someone who was not part of a something and then made a choice and then was. The harder kind, the real kind. I didn't think so many people would come, she said to Jed, standing with him near the window while the room hummed with voices around them. They were always here, he said. They just needed to see what you were going to do. And now they've seen. Now they've seen. She looked at him, her husband, which was a word she was still getting used to in the same way she was getting used to all the new words for herself. Reader, student, builder, hunter, woman. She had been adding words to that list since the morning she had walked out of her mother's house in the dark and down a mountain road and into a life she had chosen. I want to write to Catherine, she said. Tell her about today. Write tonight. Tell her everything. I want to invite her to visit. I think she'd come, Jed said. I think she would too. Clara looked out the window at the snow coming down, covering Iron Creek in white, making everything new. I want Rose to know her grandfather. Even if it's only through letters and stories, I want her to know where she came from. Jed looked at her with an expression she had learned to decode over the past year, that particular deepening of his eyes that meant something had moved him, and he was deciding whether to say it. Rose, he said. If it's a girl, Clara said. She met his eyes. In the spring. The silence that followed had its own quality, warm and enormous, filling the reception room of Hargrove's feed store in Iron Creek on a snowy November evening, while around them the town celebrated something it had taken too long to celebrate. Jed's hand found hers. He held it in the way he did most things, quietly, completely, with no part of his attention elsewhere. Rose, he said. After my grandmother, Clara said. She left me a shawl and I'm leaving her a name. That seems right. It seems right, he agreed. They went home that night, husband and wife, up the mountain road in the snow, the horses knowing the way, in the dark, the new cabin waiting with its banked fire and its south-facing window, and its second room that was almost ready. Clara had filled 3/4 of the journal Jed had given her the previous Christmas. She opened it that night and wrote a single entry. My name is Clara Calloway. I am 20 years old. I am married to a good man. I am building something that will outlast me. I am free. This is where the real story begins. She closed the journal and then looked at Jed across the fire, reading his face. Peaceful in the light, and outside the snow kept falling and kept covering the mountain and the valley. and the marks of everything that had come before. And in the morning they would wake up in their own home and begin again the way people do when they have decided that whatever came before was preparation and whatever comes next is theirs to shape. The years were generous. Clara's daughter was born in May in the new cabin delivered by Dr. Graves, who had ridden up the mountain in weather that cleared just in time. She came into the world loudly and with evident opinions about it, and Clara held her and felt the particular fierce tenderness that she had not known existed until it arrived fully formed in the first moment of her daughter's life. They named her Rose Margaret Calloway. Margaret for Jed's mother, who had done her best. A son came 2 years later, whom they named James. Catherine Brennan came from Philadelphia when Rose was 3 and James was 1, making the journey west with her husband on a train, and then by stage, and then by hired wagon up the mountain road, arriving in the late afternoon of a September day with her hair undone by the wind and her eyes bright with excitement and an expression of pure complicated joy when she saw Clara standing in the doorway of the cabin. "You look exactly like him," Catherine said. "I knew you would. I knew it from your letters." She stayed 3 weeks, and in that time filled in the picture that had been missing her father as a boy, as a young man, as the person who had set out for Wyoming, with hope and curiosity, and a particular quality of openness that Clara recognized because she had been told her whole life she didn't have it and had it all along. Catherine brought photographs. She brought a letter James Whitfield had written to his sister shortly before his death, describing the valley and the mountains and the life he was building, and his hope that his daughter would grow up knowing these things. "He wrote about you," Catherine said, handing Clara the letter carefully as though it were something fragile, "about who he hoped you'd become." Clara read it at the kitchen table while Rose slept and James played on the floor, and Jed sat across from her with his coffee and his book and his steady, patient presence. Her father had written, "I hope she grows up knowing she can choose. That's the thing I want most for her, not safety or comfort, though I want those too, but the knowledge that her life is hers to determine, that whatever she is, she chose to be it." She folded the letter. She looked at Jed, who was looking at her. "He knew," she said. "He knew what mattered." "Apple doesn't fall far," Jed said. Eleanor died in Philadelphia 3 years after Clara married. The news arrived through Catherine in a letter that was careful and kind and gave Clara nothing she needed to grieve, except what she had always been grieving, which was the mother Eleanor could have been and wasn't. She thought about Eleanor for a long time after that letter arrived, sitting on the porch in the late summer, watching Rose and James chase each other through the garden that had become, over 3 seasons of her attention, genuinely productive and a little beautiful. She thought about a woman who had been broken by loss and had chosen in her breaking to break the people nearest to her. She thought about cycles, how they begin, how they persist, how they end. She thought about the precise moment when a cycle ends, not a grand gesture or a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet choice made by someone who decides that the past is instructive, but not prescriptive, that inheritance is not destiny, that you can love your children in ways that you were never loved, and the world will not collapse from the unfamiliarity. She had made that choice every day for 3 years in 1,000 small moments, in the way she answered Rose's questions, in the patience she brought to James's frustrations, in the deliberate and sometimes effortful decision to be present and warm and safe, to make the cabin a place where her children knew without being told that they were wanted and protected and free. It was the hardest work she had ever done. It was also the most important, and she knew it was both, and she did it anyway because that was what it meant to break a cycle, not ease, not the absence of effort, but the willingness to work against a current that had been running in one direction for longer than you had been alive. She did not burn Eleanor's memory. She did not make a ceremony of forgiveness or perform absolution. She hadn't fully reached. She set Eleanor's story down the way you set down a heavy thing you have been carrying for reasons that made sense once and don't anymore, and she walked forward without it, not because it hadn't been real, but because carrying it served no purpose that she was willing to pay the cost of. She understood her father's daughter after all. Jed was 62 when Rose married. He attended the wedding with silver hair and a slight limp from an old injury that had never fully resolved, and he danced with Clara twice, which was 2 more times than either of them had expected. Given the limp, and he said to her on the way home in the wagon under a September sky full of stars, "We did something good." "We did," she agreed. "Something that'll last." She leaned against his shoulder. Below them in the valley, Iron Creek was a scatter of warm lights in the dark, and above them, the mountains were black against the sky, and around them the particular silence of a Wyoming night that was not empty but full of everything that had been built and was still standing. Rose looks like you, Jed said. When you came into my store the first time, same eyes, same way of holding herself, careful but not afraid. She's never been afraid, Clara said. No, Eden. His voice was warm. She hasn't. Clara thought that's the thing. That's the whole thing. Not that she had survived, though she had. Not that she had built a life and a home and a family, though she had done all of those. But this a daughter who had grown up without fear, who held herself as though she expected the world to treat her well, who asked for what she needed and trusted that it would be considered, and who had been right to trust that. A daughter who had never had to learn because she had never had to unlearn. The cycle was broken. That was the whole thing. My name is Clara Calloway, she wrote in her journal that night in the cabin that had stood 12 years now and showed no sign of stopping. I am 33 years old. My daughter was married today. My son is asleep in the loft. My husband is reading by the fire. My mother is gone. My father, who I never knew, left me something anyway, the knowledge that I was worth knowing. I have been building this life for 13 years, and I am not finished yet. I chose every piece of it. That is the most important sentence I know how to write. She closed the journal and set it on the shelf beside Catherine's letters and the pressed flowers and the hawk feather and all the other things she had collected in the years of her becoming. The fire burned low and warm. Outside, Wyoming was dark and vast and cold and full of the particular beauty of things that do not require your permission to be what they are. Clara Whitfield Calloway, who had started as a girl who expected pain and become a woman who had decided to expect something else, sat beside her husband and looked at the fire and was completely and without reservation content. She had chosen this, every word of it.